Hi, welcome to Pod Decoded. A neurophysiologist just went public with a warning about one of the most popular supplements in the biohacking community, and she got pushback from Andrew Huberman for it. She stood her ground. The supplement is BPC 157. If you have heard of the Wolverine stack, you know exactly what I am talking about. Millions of people are injecting it right now for injury recovery, joint pain, and performance. And her argument is that it could be quietly feeding cancer cells, and you would never know until it was too late. I broke down everything she said in this interview, and by the end, I will tell you what she actually recommends taking instead. Spoiler, it is completely free and it has more research behind it than anything on the gray market. Stay with me. Her name is Louisa Nicola. She is a neurophysiologist, meaning she studies how the brain and nervous system work at a clinical level. And she is also a former elite triathlete who competed in world championship level events. What makes her credible on this topic is not just the title, it is the fact that she actually went out publicly with this warning, got flooded with criticism from the peptides community, and held the position anyway. Andrew Huberman messaged her personally after one of her clips went viral. The exchange was civil, but she pushed back. And the reason she pushed back was not ideology, it was the data, or rather, the absence of it. Here is her core argument, and I want you to really sit with this. Not one single human randomized controlled trial has ever been completed on BPC 157. Not one. The reason is that BPC 157 went through clinical trial phases and the FDA stopped it. They flagged it as too dangerous to continue into human studies and cut the program. That is why you cannot get a prescription for it. That is why it lives in the gray market. But here is the part people seem to be skipping over. Something failed a clinical trial and we are now injecting it ourselves from unregulated suppliers because we read about it on Reddit and a few people said their shoulder felt better. Before I get into the specific mechanism of why she thinks BPC 157 is risky, I want to give you some context on who she is, because I think it changes how you hear the rest of this. She was training for the World Triathlon Championship, competing at the elite level, 200-kilometer training rides, everything dialed to a professional standard, VO2 max testing, nutrition protocol, the full picture. At the 100-kilometer mark of a training ride, an 85-year-old driver, traveling 120 kilometers an hour in an 80 zone, hit her from behind. She got pinned between his car and a guardrail. Her two training partners were thrown, bones broken, surgeries, months in a cast. She had to forfeit her world championship title. After that, she threw herself into medicine and neuroscience. When you lose the thing your entire identity was built around, you find something else to go deep on. For her, that was the brain. And specifically, what makes a brain deteriorate versus stay sharp for decades. She now works with professional athletes and high performers. Her entire mission is using the science of the brain to extend the period in life where you are actually fully functional. That is the lens she is looking at peptides through. Not trend chasing, not biohacking culture. She is asking, what does the evidence actually say about safety and what is the downside risk? Okay, before I get to the peptide mechanism, I need to give you the context she spends most of the interview building because it makes everything else make sense. Alzheimer's is tripling by the year 2050. Right now, 60 million people worldwide have the disease. By 2050, that number is expected to almost triple. Here is the part that hit me. 95% of all Alzheimer's cases are driven by lifestyle, not genetics. Only 3 to 5% of cases are tied to risk genes that you were born with. She says this clearly. You have agency over this disease. The choices you make in your 30s and 40s are what determine your brain health in your 60s and 70s. That is where her peptide objection connects to the Alzheimer's picture, because the thing with the most rigorous evidence behind it costs nothing. But I will get to that. First, the peptide problem. 2 minutes here. This is the foundation for why the BPC 157 concern actually matters. Alzheimer's is defined by two proteins, amyloid beta, which builds up outside your neurons, and tau protein, which builds up inside them. Think of your neurons as trees. Amyloid is like sap that builds up in the air between the branches. It clogs the connections. Tau is what happens inside the trunk itself. When amyloid accumulates, the synapses, the points where neurons communicate, get stuck. They cannot signal, they die. And once they die, they do not come back. Here is the part worth knowing. Your brain clears amyloid during deep sleep. Your glymphatic system, the brain's waste clearance system, runs most actively while you are in slow-wave sleep. If you are not getting quality deep sleep, you are not clearing the plaque that accumulates every single day. That is the baseline. Sleep is not optional. Sleep is the single most important thing your brain does for its own maintenance. And this connects directly to why she is worried about what BPC 157 is doing in the body. Here is what BPC 157 actually does. It promotes vascularization, the formation of new blood vessels around sites of injury. That is the mechanism that makes people believe it is helping them. New blood vessels bring oxygen and nutrients. The area heals faster. The shoulder feels better. That mechanism is real. She is not disputing that. The problem is vascularization cannot discriminate. It cannot tell the difference between a recovering tendon and a microscopic tumor. And here is the critical thing. Cancer cells grow by recruiting blood supply. A tumor's entire survival strategy is forming new blood vessels, feeding itself, growing, and eventually spreading to other parts of the body. That process is called angiogenesis. If you are walking around with an early-stage cancer cell, and she points out that we could all have stage 1 cancer right now and not know it because current imaging cannot detect tumors below a certain size, and you inject BPC 157 systemically, you have no idea whether you are accelerating that cancer's blood supply. You would not feel it. You would not see it. You would just feel your shoulder getting better and assume everything was fine. She put it very directly. How do you know when you're using BPC 157 that you are not inducing vascularization of a tumor cell? The answer is you do not. She says she would be a hypocrite not to say something, because she watches people she cares about make decisions about systemic injections, things going into their bloodstream, based on social media recommendations from people with no clinical training and no access to the actual trial data. Compare that to GLP-1s. Those are also peptides. But they have gone through phase 3 clinical trials. They are FDA approved. You get a prescription. The safety profile is documented. That is the difference. It is not about being anti-peptide. It is about having the evidence to justify the risk. Now here is what I keep thinking about after watching this. The biohacking community has this reputation for being evidence-based, optimal, scientific, and in a lot of ways it is. But there is a specific blind spot around the idea that if something makes you feel better, it must be safe. And that logic does not hold when you are talking about systemic injections of compounds with no completed human trial data. So what does Louisa Nicola actually recommend? Exercise. Specifically, cardiovascular exercise, and she has talked elsewhere about Zone 2 training in particular. Exercise increases BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is essentially a growth protein for neurons. It also directly reduces amyloid accumulation. Sleep. As I mentioned, this is the brain's cleaning cycle. She says if you are not sleeping well, everything else is downstream of that. Fix the environment first. Dim the lights 2 hours before bed. Keep the room cold and dark. No screens, no stimulating conversations. Train for sleep the same way you would train for a workout. Avoiding sugar. Chronic high blood sugar is one of the fastest ways to accelerate neuroinflammation and cognitive decline, and she mentions ketones, putting the brain in a state of ketosis, as something she is watching closely in the research, especially for people with early cognitive decline. No gray market injectables, no Wolverine stacks, nothing your body has not evolved mechanisms to handle. She is not anti-optimization. She is anti-risk where the risk is not justified by data. There is a big difference. Look, I am not here to tell you what to do with your body. This is Louisa Nicola's position, based on her clinical background and her reading of the evidence. You can disagree with her. Plenty of people in the biohacking world do. But if you have been injecting BPC 157 or considering the Wolverine stack, the mechanism she describes is real and worth understanding before you make that call. The full interview is worth watching. She goes deep on Alzheimer's genetics, the history of the amyloid hypothesis, the 40-key brainwave research, and hormone replacement therapy for women. It is a long one. If you want to go deeper on brain health, longevity, and what the science actually says versus what the content machine is selling, that is what I break down inside the free school community. Link is in my bio. Come find it. See you in the next one.